In March of 1996, I was taken to a psychiatric hospital and restrained to a bed, a little bit like this guy. My family was devastated when the psychiatrist said that I could have bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia. But I wasn't worried. What seemed insanity to everyone around me, to me seemed more like a spiritual awakening, the most sacred and special experience of my entire life. But what I didn't know until I studied the work of visionary psychiatrists like Dr. Carl Jung, Dr. Lauren Mosher, Dr. John Weir Perry, and especially Dr. Stan Grof, was that many people diagnosed bipolar also have very powerful spiritual experiences very similar to my own, and that these experiences all start with a collapse of the ego. And while not always, usually this ego collapse is caused by a period of radical change in a person's life. Now, what exactly is an ego? Well, that's not such an easy thing to explain because in our society we say like, oh, this guy's got a big ego, and we talk about it like that. But that's not really it. The ego is our false self. It's who we think we are, but we're not. And the best analogy I can come up with is to imagine that you're a baby chick and that you're inside the egg. But you also think that you're the eggshell. The eggshell is you, and in that sense, that's what our ego is. Our ego is the shell around us that we use to protect ourselves, but at the same time it limits us. It limits our full potential. So eventually we need to break out of that ego, or shell, in order to grow. So just to give you an example of what an ego is like an egg. And here we have Bill Shatner's false self, his egg, his ego. And a big part of Bill Shatner's ego is that he's 19 years old and he considers himself his dad's son. Bill and his father have a great relationship, he respects him a lot, and that's a big part of who he thinks he is. I am my dad's son. He's also Sue's boyfriend. Sue is his longtime girlfriend, they've been dating for a couple of years, and he's proud of that relationship as well. Another relationship that's very close to him is his relationship with his city, New York. He considers himself a true New Yorker, he's a Yankees fan, and he really wouldn't live anywhere else if you asked him at this point in his life. And being a true New Yorker, for him, life is all about success. If you're not a winner, then you're a loser, and get out of the way. And so Bill is very competitive, and as part of that competitive nature, he considers himself to be a very good student. He studies very hard, takes his studies very seriously, and as part of being a good student, he's working hard to get into a good university. He's also a Christian. His family is Christian, and he was raised reading the Bible. He goes to church on Sundays, and the values and the beliefs of Christianity are very close to him. So all of these different aspects of Bill's life, his religion, his relationships, his attitudes towards life, his desire to get into a good university, his city, all of these things compose who he thinks he really is on a subconscious level, and they all represent parts of his ego that he shows the world, in a sense his false self. And because he works very hard to maintain this image of himself, he has a lot of worries like, what if I don't get into a good university? Or what if I lose the people that are close to me? These sorts of things. The ego causes a lot of fear. But then something happens. His father dies, and that is a very traumatic experience for him. He really doesn't know what to do with himself, and he suffers greatly with this death. He suffers so much that when it comes time to study for his exams, he really doesn't study very much, and he fails his exams. But to his surprise, he finds that in failing, he really doesn't care that much that he failed, and he really didn't care about university the way he used to. Maybe university was something that his father wanted for him more than he did. But along with that, what happens to him as the great student? He starts to wonder, well, am I a failure? What's wrong with me? I don't want to do this anymore. I don't know why I'm pushing myself so hard. And so with his father's death, he starts to question a lot of things in his life, and as part of this questioning, he finds himself going deeper and deeper into a depression. And it's at this point that his girlfriend Sue leaves him because she just can't stand to be around a guy who's depressed all the time. And with that breakup, he really starts to question his values now. And he starts to think to himself, you know what? Ever since my dad died, I want a simpler life. Life is not about success and hard charging for me. Life is about simplicity. That's what I want my life to be about. And with that shift in values, he starts to look in different directions. And one of the directions he looks is Arizona. He decides to enroll at the University of Arizona, where he chooses to start a whole new life. But once out there, what happens to his Christianity? Well, it kind of goes up in the air because he meets all of these New Age people with completely different beliefs than what he was raised with, and they've just got this other way of looking at the world. It's very mystical. They do a lot of tarot card reading and massage, and he really doesn't believe in all that stuff, but he doesn't really know what to believe of his Christianity anymore either. And so with that, he starts to feel a little bit strange, a little lost. So many changes have happened to him so fast, and so much of his old identity, of who he thought he was, has just disappeared overnight. It all leaves him feeling like his feet are not quite touching the ground. Then, in the middle of all this change, Bill might find himself at a party, and he's had a few drinks, maybe a little marijuana, and then boom, a total ego collapse. Everything he thought about himself seems to have disappeared. He doesn't know who he is anymore. All he knows is he's got this huge surge of energy pulsating through his body, and this energy is literally taking him on a journey. He's going to a place that he's never visited. He's taking a journey into his very own soul. You literally feel your soul awakening and all of your senses coming up so strongly in this manic process that you don't really know what to do with yourself, and you're really confused. You start to ask yourself questions. What is reality? What's real? Am I going crazy? Am I dead? Am I dreaming? I don't know. Who am I becomes a very important question once you're capable of even asking yourself the question. Because let me tell you, it's a mad and mystic journey, but when possible, it should not be suppressed. Now, it's important to point out that for some people, these experiences may be very scary, and they may in fact be better off taking medications to stop the experience. However, for many others, what we know today as an acute psychosis has the potential of being a tremendously healing spiritual experience, something which can truly transform a person's life for the better. The trouble is, with the way our society aggressively handles people in these experiences, the opportunity for healing rarely happens. You see, even in the most ideal situations, there will be parts of the experience that are very difficult, even painful to go through, and to make it through, most people are going to need very compassionate support. But unfortunately, this type of support is rarely given because as a society we have very little understanding of these experiences, and as a result we're very fearful of them. And that's why it's the mission of my YouTube channel, Bipolar or Waking Up, to let people know that once you deeply understand the nature of these otherworldly experiences, you'll see that in truth they are far from the meaningless madness which our society says they are. In fact, if your manic episode was anything like Bill's or my own, it might just turn out to be the most important experience of your life. Now, what can trigger an ego collapse? Well, it could be almost anything, but for most people, like Bill, it's the combination of a series of powerful life events and changes that cause the first experience of the collapse of the ego. Bipolar enlightenment. Bipolar enlightenment. Could it be that these two experiences, which seem so different from each other, could actually be on a sensory level the same thing? At first you may think this is impossible, but when you take a closer look, both experiences start with the same event, a collapse of the ego. Now, most people already know that bipolar disorder can have some pretty negative symptoms, like spending lots of money, having big mood swings, or even hallucinations and paranoia, which I talk about at length in other videos. But few people are aware that a bipolar manic episode can also include many symptoms that have been associated throughout history with glimpses of spiritual enlightenment. So, whether you're a Buddhist monk who gets there by meditating for 20 years, or you're a 19-year-old kid who gets hit by it in a shopping mall, both experiences will most likely involve aspects which are deeply spiritual in nature. And when I say spiritual, what I really mean is mystical. So now I'm going to take you through a series of sensory experiences which are common to both the person going through an experience of enlightenment and the person going through the type of acute psychosis which is commonly associated with bipolar 1. And to illustrate my point, I'll be using the work of my favorite artist, Salvador Dali, who I'm sure you would agree, if he were alive today, would be heavily medicated. The first thing that often happens in a bipolar manic crisis, and is also known to happen in different forms of enlightenment, such as a Kundalini awakening, is that you have this incredible surge of high energy. That's usually the first thing that hits you. As I described in detail in the first video of this series, the cause of this surge in energy is that there's an ego collapse and the soul is set free for the first time. Speaking personally, the deepest mystic experience that I had was the sense of oneness with everything. You lose the feeling of separation between your body and everything else, so that you feel that you are everything and everything is you. You feel as if you've accessed a deeper level of reality, and with that there is a deeper level of understanding regarding who we are and what we're doing here on Earth. The experience is indescribable in terms of communicating in normal language, and as a result, the person in the experience may try and express themselves by using metaphors. A person's senses may also be heightened with improved vision, taste, smell, and hearing. They also have a heightened sensitivity towards other people. You can feel other people's vibe or read their thoughts in a way that you never could before. For many people, there's a sense of timelessness, with some people having the sensation that they can control time, stopping or starting time based on their own individual desire or concentration. There will often be an overwhelming sense of love coming out of you, with an affection for other people and an appreciation for beauty, so that you may find yourself having expressions of love for even plants or animals. There is a release of many repressions in these experiences, and one of the biggest is the release of the shame we have of our own bodies. This is why it's so common for people to strip naked during psychosis. And with all of this happening, there's just an overwhelming feeling of sacredness to everything, as if you're in the most magnificent church or temple in the world. Everything around you seems to be touched by God. As Dr. John Weir Perry describes in the book The Far Side of Madness, you may feel that you're in a type of middle world, not quite heaven, not quite earth, a sort of purgatory or bardo in which all of these experiences are happening. And very often in this middle world, you'll feel that you're being tested by God in some way, and that maybe even people are coming to you not as they appear, as in their earthly name, but as some sort of characters that are there to test you. And a big part of this test will involve a confrontation with death. Most people feel that they are somehow encountering their own death or think that they have died in this process. As part of the healing which takes place, there is often a regression into the origins of your own life. Many people find themselves returning to their early childhood or even into the womb of their mother. Others have the sensation of returning to the beginning of the cosmos, the Big Bang in a sense. And for some, it's a combination of both, as well as other powerful experiences, such as recalling a past life. And as your process starts to move through, you begin to have a shift in your values. Your own feelings and sense of personal integrity become more important to you than they ever were before. There's also a broadening of your consciousness, an elevation to a more social, global consciousness. So that global issues such as the environment or poverty, which maybe were in the back of your mind before, now are right in front of you as a pressing issue. So, like I was saying in the beginning, if you're a 19-year-old kid who's been hit by a bipolar manic crisis, you should easily be able to recognize some, if not all, of these sensory experiences that I'm talking about. But what you didn't know is that throughout history, all of these sensory experiences that you have had have somehow been related to different forms of enlightenment. These mystical sensory experiences have been associated with Satori in Zen, Samadhi in Hinduism, Nirvana from Buddhism, and even the visions which Christian saints would have. And in the West, these experiences have been recognized by a number of psychologists and psychiatrists as well, leading-edge people such as Dr. Stan Grof, who refer to these experiences as being part of a spiritual emergency. Ken Wilber refers to a variety of mystic experiences, and I think all of these would be related to what he calls nature mysticism. And Abraham Maslow, who is most famous for the Maslow hierarchy of needs, referred to what I describe here as part of a peak experience. So there's clearly a history of understanding these experiences on a psychological level in the West. However, what is enlightenment or a mystic experience in the mainstream today? Well, according to science, psychiatry, and our supposedly modern society, Enlightenment is insanity. It's a bipolar manic crisis, an acute psychosis. It doesn't exist. It's a complete breakdown of our rational thought caused by brain damage or a chemical imbalance. It has no value to your life whatsoever, and it's to be stopped with medications at all costs. Now what I want to do in part 2 of this video is show you some examples of how each of these spiritual experiences can lead to some very strange behavior on your part, behavior which everyone around you will mistakenly see as signs of mental illness. So that's up next. Okay, so now let's go back and review the sensory experience which you have after your ego collapses and see how this plays out in your behavior, which everyone around you will take for symptoms that you've lost your mind. Well, to start with this incredible surge of energy that you have, you can't sleep, you can't stop moving, and you can't stop talking. Now, to help you move through this period of high energy, the best thing to do is to find a way to express it through art, writing, or even dance or exercise. Basically, anything you can do to work the energies through that you're dealing with. With that sense of oneness I was talking about, everything might seem like a dream and you'll want to test reality. You might want to try and walk through a wall or go out and stand in traffic or even fly out a window, and that of course can be very dangerous for you. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be strapped to a hospital bed against your will, but anyone in a state of acute psychosis should have 2 people with them to offer protection and emotional support at all times. Because you'll have this deeper understanding, you'll want to share your ideas with people, but most of the time they won't be ready to listen to what you have to say. It could be because what you are saying is confusing to them, or perhaps your new ideas are disturbing to them because they're so different from their way of seeing things. And like I said in the previous video, the experience is so indescribable that you may use metaphors to try and explain what's happening to you, like, I'm in heaven or I am God. And while you may be speaking symbolically or poetically, the people around you could take you literally, thinking, he thinks he's in heaven, he thinks he's God, he's totally crazy. And that's why it's very important that any support people that you do have working with you need to be very open-minded and very non-judgmental about what's happening to you. Now, it is true that some people get stuck in delusions which they themselves take very literally, such as thinking that they're Jesus the Messiah. However, if someone is healing and working through their process, these strongly held delusions should loosen their grip within a few weeks, perhaps even a few days. And with the enhanced sensory experience, you may respond very strongly to smells or noises, or be very entranced by certain visual patterns, leading to more strange behavior. Speaking personally, it was my own fascination with the heightened sensory world that I was in, which led me into thinking that I was dead. Another place where this heightened sensitivity can cause you problems is at the psychiatric hospital, because being in such a cold and hostile environment, people tend to act terribly in front of their psychiatrist, giving them more proof that you need medications. But the truth is, you may just be reacting to your surroundings and how you're being treated. Because you enter a world of timelessness, you may have no idea how long you've been in the hospital or how long you've been in a certain situation. What day is it? What year is it? And of course, the people around you will find this very disturbing. Perhaps one of the most positive aspects of the bipolar manic crisis is the overwhelming sense of love that you can feel inside of yourself, and your willingness to express this love with perhaps even perfect strangers who are just sending you a positive energy. You may want to put your arms around them, hug them, or perhaps even get sexual with them. And even with this somewhat positive experience, it may be looked on with fear from others because it's so different and it's not normal. I think one of the key characteristics of bipolar mania is your loss of shame, and when that comes, you immediately want to take off your clothes almost in protest. It's like you look down and you think, what are these clothes doing on me? And you need to get naked, and very often you may want to even piss or shit, basically anywhere that you are. And even masturbation isn't out of the question because it goes along with this total release of repressions. That sense of sacredness I talked about can lead you into revering or bowing to people as you truly identify with the God side of them. You may see people who are close to you that are giving you love as some sort of saint or angel, and you'll treat them accordingly. And don't forget, being in a sort of middle world, people often tend to get quite delusional. They start to make up stories about what's really happening to them. And in that story, they may think of themselves as some sort of historical character like Jesus or perhaps a king. And as you come to them, they'll see you as a different character as well. And as you're being tested by God, you will often be very disobedient with worldly authority. You'll resist arrest, you might fight people who are trying to control you, and you will literally think that this is a matter of life and death for you. And in fact, it may be, because even though it is an apparent delusion, it has tremendous symbolic meaning for you as a person going through it. Think about it. How you're able to work through this very difficult spiritual experience is going to have a direct impact on how you live the rest of your life. As part of the confrontation with death that I mentioned, you may think that you need to kill yourself in a way in order to move on to the next level, to the spirit world, and leave this material world behind. This can lead to a form of a ritualized suicide. Now, this suicide isn't so much an attempt to end your life as it is to continue your life on the spirit level, and so it can be very symbolic. For example, in my situation, a suicide was simply turning out the lights in a ballroom I was in. The imagery of regressions can come in many forms. Personally, I remember revisiting parts of my childhood, then going back into experiences of the cosmos. At one point in the hospital, I was making ape noises as I was visualizing scenes from the movie A 2001 Space Odyssey. Like I was going back to the beginning of time, and that movie was the representation of that return. And believe me, when you start making ape noises in front of the psychiatrist, you're in for a long stay. And finally, with your shift in values, expanded awareness, and increasing concern for social issues, you might see yourself getting very emotional about issues that never seemed to bother you before. Disturbing images that you see on TV, or even buried problems within your own family may get you very upset, whereas before you would just put up with it. In fact, bringing up family issues or family secrets is such a central part of the healing of acute psychosis that I've dedicated one video to this subject alone. So despite the fact that many of the experiences or emotional shifts which you are going through are quite positive, your behavior will be strange, and almost everything you do will be interpreted negatively by almost everyone around you. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize by making this sound like one big party that was ruined by your parents and doctors, because once your healing process begins, there will be a lot of fear and pain that you'll need to open up to as well. And from what I've seen, I believe that a big part of the fear is simply connected to the newness of the whole experience. So that even for people who have quite positive manic experiences, once they snap back into reality, they might find the transition very frightening because they don't know what just happened to them. Another source of fear or pain will be related to the trauma or even negative energies that you may have carried around for your entire life. It was Dr. Carl Jung who first identified this somewhat scary part of ourselves, calling it the shadow, over 80 years ago. And when our shadow starts to come out, we can start to act pretty nasty. One minute we may be saying to someone that we love them, and then maybe 20 minutes later we're looking at them saying, "I hate you, get out of my face." And so with all of these spiritual aspects happening, being in a middle world, having strong experiences of love as well as fear, you may even start to question your own sanity in the middle of this, and at the very least you'll be very confused about what's happening to you. But what's important to remember is that all of this is part of a very complex spiritual healing process, which, if at all possible, needs to be supported and not blocked. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that yes, when a person goes into the acute psychosis often associated with bipolar mania, they do exhibit very strange behavior, there's no doubt about it. But there are reasons for this. There is a sensory experience that the person is undergoing beneath the surface of things that up to now modern psychiatry has simply dismissed as signs of mental illness. And I think that if more people in a bipolar manic crisis are going to heal, that the support network we have of doctors, families, and friends needs to come at this with more love and less fear. They need to support this person, and they need to understand that this is basically a healing spiritual event that needs to happen for their long-term benefit. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that after you pass through an experience like this without medication, that you'll reach ultimate enlightenment and all of your problems will go away, because that's not going to happen. But the more you understand how to work through these processes, the better off you'll be. Starting in April 2007, I began an investigation into the difference between the beneficial psychotic episode that I had 12 years ago, which I came to understand as a spiritual emergency, and this thing called bipolar disorder, or more specifically bipolar mania, which some people in my family had been diagnosed with a year ago. As many of you know, during this year of research, I've made many YouTube videos, and through YouTube, I've been in close contact with over 150 bipolar people who have been gracious enough to share their stories with me. I've received thousands of YouTube comments that I've also learned from. I've read about 15 new books in that time and looked at hundreds of websites and videos, both for psychiatry and against psychiatry. And together with my wife, we've worked with 4 people this year through 6 manic episodes of acute psychosis, basically periods of insanity like I went through 12 years earlier. And the big thing I've learned this year is that while there's no guarantees, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia can be healed. And if you don't believe me, I highly suggest that you take a look at the work of some pioneering psychiatrists from the 1970s who were healing schizophrenics in a way completely different than the typical hospitalization environment that we all know today. The late Dr. John Weir Perry documents very high levels of success rates with schizophrenics at his clinic Diabasis in his book Trials of a Visionary Mind. Dr. Loren Mosher also set up a similar project called Trezirea in San Francisco while he was the chief of the Schizophrenia Center at the National Institute of Mental Health. The book Trezirea is a great look at what happened in that house for over a 12-year period. And I also have a film of Trezirea in my YouTube favorites that's very interesting for you to take a look at. Dr. Stan Grof has made a career of healing people from various mental illnesses, many of the stories of which he shares in his new book, When the Impossible Happens, which really challenges mainstream psychiatry. Perhaps the most interesting story is of Dr. David Lukoff, who in 1972 thought he was Buddha and Christ and was here on a messianic journey to save the world. Dr. David Lukoff is the one that fought to get the term spiritual emergency recognized in the DSM-IV. Now here's the shocker. The reason that these doctors can heal people in acute psychosis like bipolar mania, schizophrenia, spiritual emergencies is that they recognize that acute psychosis in itself is intended to be a healing process. It's not a mental illness at all. It is a healing process. You see, what happens in an acute psychosis is not that you've lost your mind, but rather that you've been plunged into the subconscious of your mind. Now, the problem with our society today, be it the doctors or our parents, is that we don't give value to this experience, and in fact, we think that the non-ordinary states of consciousness that you go into during a psychotic period have no value whatsoever. In fact, we're terrified of them as a society, and as a result, we don't want you to go there. You are not allowed to have this experience. So what happens is the doctors and the family, they form a rescue mission to get you out of that water. And as we all know, part of that rescue mission now means hospitalizing you, medicating you, telling you that you're mentally ill and that you have a permanent condition like asthma or diabetes that you will need medication for your entire life. And unfortunately, as things are today, this is what's happening, because once they tell you these things and they get you medicated and hospitalized in this way and tell you that this experience is to be feared and avoided, well, it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and you never heal properly the way you're supposed to. And that's why bipolar people, as soon as they go off their medications, it doesn't take them very long usually before they go into a relapse, because this is a healing process, much like if you were vomiting. You've got some sickness inside of you and it needs to come out. And as soon as those medications stop, the vomiting starts again. It's a healing process. You're supposed to go into psychosis. And once you're there, once you're in that non-ordinary state of consciousness, instead of fighting against this process, what you really need to do is surrender and just let go. And during this acute psychosis, what I've especially learned working with people this year is that unlike my own situation where I was able to fight off negative forces and sort of respect my experience, most people, bipolar people, especially if you're younger, are absolutely going to need support and help to get through this process. And where people especially need the help and support isn't so much when they're in that sort of high state where everything's sort of dreamy and sparkly and wonderful, but during periods where trauma is released. Because the secret to this acute psychosis is it is releasing you from trauma that you've held in your body for your entire life. And the trauma that is released can come in a variety of forms. In my case, I had a scuba diving accident a few months before my manic episode, and that experience really came back to me and started my episode. So physical problems and physical accidents can be part of the trauma that's released. The most common one to psychology is like things like the relationship you have with your parents. And I would say almost everybody I talked to, maybe everybody, had an issue with one of their parents, where the parent tends to be kind of a hard person that insists that the child live according to their rules and according to their ways. Most of the bipolar people I know have had an issue with a particular hard parent. And in the case of, especially with schizophrenia, this parenting trouble can be deeper. It can be related to physical abuse, and for many schizophrenics, sexual abuse is a huge part of the trauma they're dealing with in their daily life. And we're just covering it up and covering it over by telling them that they've got a chemical imbalance. So instead of dealing with bipolar mania like this, we've got to start dealing with it more like this. And I intentionally picked out this picture because it shows a compassionate love between two men, which would normally be taken as a homosexual relationship. But I'm telling you that when you're dealing with a person in acute psychosis, you've got to be available to give them unconditional love regardless of their sex. You've got to be able to bond with them on a very intimate level. And the reason is that when people are in a manic state, they are so much more sensitive than you could ever imagine. And as soon as you're in front of them, they can tell whether you are coming to them with love or you're coming to them with fear. And as it's dealt with now, everybody is coming at them with fear. So again, these people need to be approached with a loving intention. Their inner experience needs to be respected and validated as a sacred thing, a sacred healing process that they need to go through. And with your support, the person can now engage this inner process, and they really need that support because it can be scary for them. Like I said, it can really feel like a life and death situation. Now, typically, an acute psychosis is going to last maybe between 2 and 6 days. That's like when they're really out there and can be really insane, and they really require 2 people with them 24 hours a day during this period. And depending on the depth of the trauma that we're dealing with, it could take a few psychoses for this to actually finish. So in the example of my niece, she needed 3 manic episodes before she finally finished her process, and that took over a period of 2 months. So, is this process long and difficult? Sometimes, yes. It can be very difficult, especially to be a support person for these people. You need a lot of patience, you need a lot of compassion, and you need a lot of courage. However, even though this process can be very difficult for people for a few months, the benefit you get on the other end can be a total rebirth of this person. Not only do they go back to normal, but they come back healed. They go on to live a much more vital, much more alive life, and they can grow. And when you compare that to the long-term life of medication, thinking of yourself as mentally ill forever, I mean, there's just no comparison. So, in conclusion, obviously, this video is just the tip of the iceberg regarding what is a radically different approach to your bipolar disorder. And if you are bipolar out there, I highly recommend you subscribe, because for the rest of 2008, I'm going to be putting up one video after another that's going to help you look at your bipolar disorder in a whole new way. They call it bipolar disorder, a permanent mental illness caused by a chemical imbalance. But that's not what it feels like when you're bipolar. No, for most it feels a lot more like I can't be me disorder. Everyone else seems to be happy, going to school or work, having fun, being popular and successful. Why not you? Why can't you find your happiness? Maybe you do have a problem with your brain. Or do you? Maybe you're not broken at all. Maybe the world is simply not ready for someone like you, someone who feels life with an extra degree of intensity, someone who's probably had more than their share of pain at a fairly young age, someone who has a hard time dealing with how fake and phony the real world really is. But what is real? Well, as it turns out, our reality is not nearly as real as we thought it was. In fact, according to quantum physics, life itself is a lot more like the Matrix than most of us ever realized. However, unlike Neo, the prison that we're trapped in isn't run by evil machines. In our case, the walls of our prison are nothing but your own ego, and it's your ego which dictates your reality and your identity. In other words, the prison is in your mind. Now, what exactly is an ego is a big issue of debate, because you see, back just a few decades ago, Western psychologists were in the general agreement that the ego was who you are, and that the task of the psychologist was to help you develop your healthy ego so that you could function in this real, and by real I mean material, world. However, starting in the 1960s, some radical thinkers like Harvard psychologists Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert started looking at our ego in an older, mystical, spiritual way. Why? Because these doctors were having mystical experiences themselves, experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs. Says Timothy Leary, I learned more about my brain during the 5 hours I was on magic mushrooms than I had in the preceding 15 years of studying and researching psychology. Dr. Richard Alpert was so overwhelmed by his LSD experiences that eventually he went on a spiritual quest to India. Once there, he was given the name Ram Das by an enlightened guru, and upon returning from India became one of the great spiritual teachers of the 1970s. Now, speaking personally, I've never had any experience with hallucinogenic drugs, or any drugs for that matter, and I don't recommend them. However, it's also obvious that for Drs. Leary and Alpert, taking the hallucinogenics helped them to broaden their understanding of how our minds work. And the big insight that they had with regard to our minds was that the ego is not who we are, because under the influence of these drugs we lose our ego, and yet somehow we're still there. So unlike Freud had suggested, our ego is not who we are. Our ego is who we think we are, but we're not. It's our false self. And it is this false self which defines and limits not only our reality, but also our identity. Indeed, for all of us, our idea of what is real and what is possible is much more limited than any of us could have ever imagined, because our ego prevents us from seeing ourselves and our reality in any other way. So in other words, our egos are literally illusions that we live in which limit our reality. And with that said, the question becomes, well, if the ego is an illusion, why do we need it? Why is an ego important for us? A good analogy is to look at the world. Okay, here's the real world. But this isn't how we see the world. We see the world more like this, the map that has the countries on it. And all of these countries have boundaries. These boundaries are what separate me from you, Canada from the US, France from Germany, this sort of thing. And while the boundaries between these countries are illusions, in another way they are absolutely necessary, because if they came down today, our world would go into total chaos. And in the same way that the world would go into chaos without its borders, we go into a type of chaos without our egos. Without our ego there to limit us and protect us, we become like a kite without a string, flying high but totally ungrounded and in danger. In psychiatry today, they refer to this state as an acute psychosis, and it is in being in an acute psychosis that our true selves, or our souls, are set free on this material plane of reality. Now, the soul is an incredible thing. So connected to God that once you're in an acute psychosis of a manic episode, you may feel that you're God himself, or Jesus, or Buddha, or some other spiritual figure. In fact, without the ego there to protect it, the behavior of the soul is compelled towards being completely unrepressed. So, looked at from this perspective, rather than being a mental illness, we can start to see bipolar disorder as being an epic battle happening within the psyche, a battle between the soul, which wishes to be free, completely free to express itself in every way, and the ego, which is attempting to suppress any soulful expression or emotions which it deems to be dangerous to the survival of the body itself. And in this battle, when the soul overcomes the ego, we're in a state of mania or even acute psychosis. When the ego completely overcomes the soul, we go into a state of depression. And it's this unresolved conflict between the ego and the soul which is at the root of the cycling of bipolar disorder. As long as the conflict is there, we will move back and forth between mania and depression. And this battle will continue until it comes to a proper end, an end which medications bring about too quickly. Because what psychiatric medications do is they basically dull the chemistry of your body so that the ego can again take control of the situation, keeping the soul in check. And once that happens, you're considered sane again and you can function in daily reality.
But as we all know, without more drugs, people often slip from mania into depression because once the ego is in total control, the soul has little room to grow, to expand, and as a result, starts to feel dead. Once on antipsychotic medication, those limiting walls of reality seem even bigger and more imposing than they did before. Now, ironically, the so-called hallucinogenic drugs like LSD-25 or the organic magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, or even occasionally marijuana can have the opposite effect, but not as you might expect. I mean, these drugs were called hallucinogenics because it was assumed by doctors that it was the drugs themselves that were providing the hallucination experiences, the feelings of euphoria, etc. But that's really not what they do. What these drugs do is they cause a collapse, a temporary collapse of the ego functioning. And the hallucinations and delusions and the visions of angels and feelings of being God are all within you. They are experiences within yourself that are finally released now that the ego has collapsed. Now, for anyone who is bipolar, schizophrenic, or even completely normal, this battle between the true self of the soul and the false self of the ego should seem obvious. I mean, every day in our normal lives, there are things that we want to do, say, or experience that we don't, simply because we're afraid. And we do this because we learned at a young age that it's a lot easier to get along in life when you conform to other people's expectations of you than to be who you really are. And that may all be well and good when you're a little kid and you've got to learn how to behave yourself. But if you continue to live a life of total conformity, what you'll find yourself living is a life that's completely dead. You won't feel alive in your own life. And in this way, we are all repressed. We're all divided. Not only those people who are bipolar, but pretty much everybody else on the planet. My favorite guru Osho spent his whole life trying to heal this division within completely normal people. And this is what he had to say regarding normal life as it is today. In the past, we were unable to create real human beings. Instead, we made humanoids. A humanoid is one who looks like a human being, but is utterly challenged. He's divided because he is half. He is always tense, and he cannot celebrate. Others have been running his life for him. The parents, the teachers, the leaders, the priests. They've all taken away his decisiveness. They decide, they order. He simply follows. The humanoid is a slave. Only a fulfilled tree will flower, and man is yet to flower. The new man will be earthy and divine, worldly and otherworldly. He will live without any inner division, without getting split. He will transcend duality. He will not be schizophrenic. And with the new man will come a new world, because the new man will perceive in a qualitatively different way. Right now, the new man is bound to be a mutant minority, but he carries with him a new culture, a new seed. We now need a new humanity in which religion and science become two aspects of one human being, and art will be the bridge. That's why I say that the new man will be a mystic, a poet, and a scientist all together. He will be a mystic because he will feel the presence of God. He'll be a poet because he will celebrate that presence. And he will be a scientist because he will search into this presence through scientific methodology. And when man becomes all these three things together, man becomes whole. And to create the new man, you need to begin with yourself. So, looking at the world through Osho's eyes, I think it's pretty clear that the only disorder in bipolar disorder is the disorder of living the fake, everyday, normal life. So the next time you find yourself thinking, I can't be me, you might want to back up a bit and ask yourself, well, who are you? Because the reality that you're looking for is a lot closer than you think. And while the journey to get there may be difficult, it basically comes down to one thing: bringing the bipolar battle of the soul versus the ego to its proper end, where the soul is no longer repressed by the ego, but is served by the ego. And that's what I'm going to talk about next.